Well, I just heard you use the word diversity and you know, a couple of times, and I guess I'm wondering how successful we will be, particularly with your references to the Black Lives Movement, Jim, if we do not address issues around racial justice in our work. Because if you address the issue of racial justice, you don't have to worry about diversity, right? And so how are we going to bring that to fore? Because it's critical. I think one of the reasons why we do not hear about the fact that this year more trans women of color have been killed than in previous years is because they are trans women of color, right? They're trans and they're women of color, right? And so how is that work going to happen in our organizations, nationally, locally? Any ideas about that? And anyone can respond.
Well, I would say we have to stop these efforts of politicians creating this environment of hate where you're legalizing discrimination, where you're calling out kids and saying that they're somehow not normal or not worth the same as all Americans, and so we've created in Orlando to see that horrific killing of 49 brothers and sisters of our community. When politicians go out and use this as a tool and they normalize this kind of hate, you've created an environment for it. And so, I mean, to me, that at least for Lambda Legal and for myself personally, that's a place that we can start to fight back and to shut those people down.
I think that, speaking of like from folks who work actually at LGBT organizations, I do think it does also mean that we need to just say things are racist. We say things like disproportionately impact people of color. That's racism. That's what that is. And I think it sounds easier. I mean, it is easier to say it that way, but it's racism. And I think particularly LGBT organizations, I think we can really move things along by saying that racism exists and that we as a community, this needs to be a central part of our work. Actually at NCLR, we're in the process of going through some self-examination around like, what does it mean to be a racial justice organization? And so we're going to have hard conversations. But you know what? I'm proud that our organization is going through that process, because we really do believe that we are committed to racial justice, but that doesn't mean to take certain stances that may not be popular, like even in the LGBT world, in the LGBT space. But it's because we are committed to that. And so I do think that's how I see that happening, that people are just owning that and just really taking that leadership and taking those risks to really put themselves out the line as leaders and as organizations.
Well, as the data wonk, I would say that, you know, I let the data drive that. And so, you know, Tyrone mentioned the chart with the youth and the facilities, and 85% of LGBT kids in juvenile justice facilities are kids of color, right? So like the issue is kids of color get locked up. LGBT kids who get locked up are kids of color. And so I think if we think about what the data says about LGBT people, and there's a new study out from GLSEN about school pushout, and that it's brown and black queer kids who are getting pushed out of school at higher rates. And so I feel like the data shows us that our work has to be intersectional, because it's not just because they're gay, it's not just because they're black, it is the two of those together. And I think that the other exciting thing is that MAP always partners with progressive organizations, as do many of us, and that progressive orgs are starting to get it too, right? Like at least in the school pushout sphere, there's been all this conversation about non-conforming girls of color getting pushed out of schools. Well, we have a strong stake in that work, right? Whether they identify as LGBT or not, if you're non-conforming in some way, you've got a target on your back. And so I think that we also have that stake and can really work with organizations that are doing that kind of intersectional work and come to them and say, hey, we get it, we want to do this. And we may not be perfect at it, as Tyrone said, we have to do the work too. But I think that they look to us because we won on marriage in many ways of like, what's your secret sauce? And I think that it's an opportunity for us to say, we really care about poverty. How can we get involved in the poverty fight? How can we get involved in the criminal justice fight? And because it is our issue too.